Today's guest is podcast rock star Josh Toll of King and Spalding. Josh spoke to us from our recording studio in Washington, D.C., where he's also based. We hope you enjoy our conversation. Hi, Josh. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed our discussion last time, so it's a pleasure to be back.
Awesome. So we're going to just jump right in. For people who have missed the last episode, could you give us a quick overview of King and Spalding and what you do?
Right. So I'm very fortunate to have the role of pro bono partner at King and Spalding. I've been leading our pro bono program for about 5 years now, and I'm responsible for leadership of our pro bono program firm-wide. Like many firms, our pro bono program, our policy, I should say, is based on the model PBI definition. So thank you for that. Basically, our pro bono program boils down to representing people of limited means, taking on civil rights matters, and helping nonprofits that are on the ground helping people. And we really do all three of those things. It's obviously a very broad net. And we have a particular emphasis at King and Spalding on helping the most vulnerable members of our society. That may be victims of domestic violence, who, as you know, are often facing severe power inequalities. It may be disabled veterans. I want to talk about one of those matters in a few minutes. Or child immigrants, who are very much in the news right now, as you know, just to name a few examples.
Great. So you were just talking about people who need your help. In our previous discussion, we talked about your passion for the Clemency Project. And recently you worked with the project to defend Darren Perkins, who you helped win clemency for just a month ago. It was very recent. Could you tell us about the case and your experience?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I'm really happy and proud of my work on Mr. Perkins' case. It was a very rewarding matter. I want to recognize the efforts of my co-counsel, Professor Jane Ann Murray of University of Minnesota Law School, who first brought the case to my attention. And this is a good example of the power of relationships in the sense that I met Professor Murray during the earlier Clemency Project 2014, and we had gotten to know each other. She had helped me with some of those matters, and we kept in touch. And she brought this matter to my attention. And, this case is really about, in addition to relationships, really about the power of persistence. As a pro bono lawyer, your mantra really has to be never give up. And I think this case really shows that principle. You always have to be brainstorming different legal theories and avenues, and when one avenue gets shut down, you have to be ready to pursue another. And in this case, prior to me getting involved, Professor Murray represented Mr. Perkins in his clemency application, and she really felt like, and I agree, that he had a strong clemency case. But unfortunately, he was denied clemency from President Obama. And as you know, the clemency and pardon power, very much in the news right now. And as I'm sure you also know, unlike a court decision, they don't have to give you a reason when they turn you down. So you just get a no. And so Mr. Perkins' clemency application was denied with no explanation. And at that point, to Professor Murray's credit, she really didn't give up. She contacted me and said, hey, let's see if we can get this done in the courts. And when I heard about Darren's background and how deserving he was of relief, of course, I was very eager to get involved. I probably talked about this last time, but I'm a former public defender. So these types of cases are very near and dear to my heart. And this case was a little bit, I would say, even more challenging than normal because Darren had two sentences, a federal life sentence, which is life without parole, as well as a D.C. sentence in Superior Court, just down the street, and that was 18 years consecutive to his life sentence. And if that sounds daunting, it really was, but we, of course, decided to attack it one sentence at a time. And thankfully, we were able to get relief in federal court based on retroactive changes to the sentencing guidelines. And that, based on those changes, we were able to get the sentence changed from life to 360 months. And that does sound like a lot. However, Darren had already done 26 years, which based on credit for good time served is the equivalent of 30 years. So that sentence was basically complete. But the D.C. sentence was a lot trickier because unlike with the federal sentence, there was no obvious way for us to get into court. The time to file a motion to alter the sentence had passed years ago, so we were untimely. But it's funny how life works. When you just identify a goal and keep fighting, doors really do have a way of opening, and that happened in this case. We decided to file an out-of-time motion to amend, And the DC Court of Appeals, had already held, thankfully, that the deadline for that type of motion is not jurisdictional. However, it was an open question whether it was a mandatory claims processing rule, meaning that the judge has no discretion whether to uphold it, or a permissive rule, and meaning that the judge could waive it if he so chose. And in this case, the U.S. Attorney's Office initially objected on timeliness grounds, said we were too late, but Professor Murray and myself engaged in a sustained negotiation with the U.S. Attorney's Office. And when it came time to go to court, we weren't sure what was going to happen. We were ready to argue the motion, ready to argue the timeliness point, but we were very pleased to find that the U.S. Attorney's Office had changed their position, and our advocacy had really paid off. And to their credit, the U.S. Attorney's Office really took a holistic view of Mr. Perkins' file. And I think they were influenced by many factors, but most especially his excellent disciplinary record over 26 years, which really speaks volumes. He really had turned his life around, and that really shone through. And so we were really happy to see that the U.S. Attorney's Office withdrew their objection, and they agreed to reduce Mr. Perkins' sentence to just 16 months. So we went from 18 years to 16 months, which was an incredible reduction. But the most rewarding thing was all of Darren's family who came to court that day. He had about 10 relatives who came to court, including 2 of his children. And they were so happy when we let them know that the judge was going to agree and grant Mr. Perkins relief. Many of them were in tears. And it really brought it home for me and for Professor Murray just how rewarding this work was. And at this point, Mr. Perkins is scheduled to be released at the beginning of December, so just a couple more months, and we're really excited.
That's amazing. 18 years to 16 months is quite the jump. I watched the PBS NewsHour segment with him. And
he did a great job.
Yeah, it's funny because you're watching it at the end of that. It's like, he's still awaiting. It's like, not anymore.
Yeah,
it's funny coming into this.
You need to put a little blurb on the end there.
Right after that. So let's talk more about your involvement with the Clemency Project. What works well and what could have been improved from a pro bono volunteer and client operations standpoint?
Right. So our work on the Clemency Project was really a highlight of our recent pro bono program. We had 40 clients as a firm and about 60 King and Spalding lawyers across almost all of our U.S. offices, and actually a couple of international offices were involved. So we really put together a great team, and we were able to get clemency for 12 of our clients, which we're very proud of, and almost all 12 were serving life without parole in the federal system prior to our work. And in 2 other cases, we obtained relief in the courts, sort of like in Mr. Perkins' case. That function is the equivalent of clemency. So we were able to really get relief for a very high proportion of our clients, which we're really happy about. And I have to say, before addressing the program more generally, just want to take a slight detour and just say that hearing our clients' stories were so powerful. Really, different experiences, but what they had in common was that they really were low-level offenders, and they really were caught in the middle of these excessively harsh sentencing schemes, statutes, and federal sentencing guidelines, which, of course, as I said, have since been changed. But hearing their stories were just so compelling and really so rewarding. And I have to say also that looking back on it, I think the project has to be seen as a massive success. My understanding, obviously so many firms got involved, solo practitioners. Well over 2,000 petitions were submitted as part of the project overall. And when you consider that, I think President Obama granted about 1,700 petitions as part of Clemency Project 2014. So that shows you what a major role this project played. And really a huge shout out to the organizers, ACLU, Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, ABA, NACDL, Families Against Mandatory Minimums, Federal Defenders. I would totally be remiss if I didn't mention them and all of the great work that they did. And so as far as what worked and what didn't work or what could have been changed, like any project, I think that there were some technical snafus early on, to be expected for a project of this size, but to their credit, the organizers had a technical person. They really ironed out the difficulties. I would say what worked well, the training was really helpful. I think in any type of massive project like this, it's really important to get a standardized training so everyone's kind of working from the same understanding. And unlike me, a former public defender, I was able to get a lot of my colleagues involved who had no prior criminal law experience and no prior experience, of course, dealing with the federal sentencing guidelines, which, as you know, are very technical. So the training was extremely helpful. We had corporate lawyers that weren't even litigators get involved, and the training allowed them to get up to speed. And also in the area of what worked well, the database, the Clemency Project database worked very well. I think when you're piloting, again, such a massive project, having a centralized database is so important. It allowed us to all collaborate in a secure and efficient way. And the database was how you sort of took the case from start to finish. And it was very well kind of thought out and organized. And how all the training materials, everything was in one place. So that was extremely helpful. As far as what could have been improved or worked out, what could have been done a little bit differently, I honestly think that most of the challenges were really not the fault of the organizers at all, but were more inherent in clemency work generally. For example, many of these were really old cases, old convictions, old sentences. A lot of the court records weren't on Pacer, they weren't online. My colleagues and myself had to do a lot of digging. And you'd be amazed how many times we would contact the original lawyer. And they would say, I don't have those files anymore. Meanwhile, your client's serving a life sentence. You think you might want to keep those documents around. And so we had a lot of obstacles in terms of gathering records, which you really need to be able to conduct the analysis. I think another challenging aspect was just, again, because it's not a court system, it could sometimes feel like a bit of a black box. You do all this work, you submit your application to the Office of the pardon attorney, and then it could just sit there, and there's really no way to move it forward, and you're just kind of playing a waiting game, and that part was difficult. And I think the other related aspect to that was that with clemency work, there's not necessarily a deadline. Had this been a court situation, normally you have a deadline. With clemency work, it was sort of like, get this in as quickly as possible, and so you have that pressure of, I have to submit this as soon as possible. And of course, all of my pro bono lawyers are balancing many things. And so it was just not really knowing when it's due. And you obviously didn't want to wait until the last day of Obama's term, because then he's going to be gone. So you knew you had to get it in as quickly as possible. But given all these difficulties, it was sometimes hard to get all the records. And then it was just like a lot of pressure to get it in without a real firm deadline. But we navigated all of these various hurdles, and like I said, it was really a great experience.
I never thought about the records thing, but that's totally true, because as much time's passed, it's not getting the records. It's like even the way things were done and how reliable it was. Yeah, I never thought of that, so that must have been a challenge.
It was, but it was actually kind of fun. You were a bit like an archaeologist, going back in history and excavating various records. And sometimes you would get a case, and then there would be, one of the convictions that might be for something that could be a disqualifying factor. So then you have to sort of dig into that conviction, and it was really, really fun.
Can you update us on any recent projects or cases the firm is working on since we last chatted?
Absolutely. I have a few they'd like to talk about that I think are really exciting and innovative in their own ways. I'm happy to report that we have become involved in an innovative project in Atlanta. As you probably know, Atlanta is the home of our biggest office, where King & Spalding started, and I, of course, spend a lot of time there. We partner with the Atlanta Volunteer Lawyers Foundation, one of our main pro bono partners. I've seen them at your conference many times. And Marty Ellen is their director, and Michael Lucas is their deputy director. And I just want to throw a shout out to those guys, because they're such a pleasure to work with, and they do such a great job. And they decided to start a new project about a year ago called Standing With Our Neighbors. And it's really innovative in a couple of different ways, and we're really pleased to be part of it. The main concept is, rather than asking our pro bono clients from underserved areas to come to us, in Midtown Atlanta, instead, we want to go to them. We want to send our lawyers to their neighborhoods to actually get on the ground in these communities, to really see what's going on with our own eyes, and to really kind of fight the fight in the trenches, as it were. And the second aspect is that they really thought holistically, AVLF, about some of the problems in some of these underserved communities. And they spoke to a lot of people, they reviewed a lot of data, And what they realized is that housing conditions are a huge problem in a lot of these Atlanta neighborhoods. And what was happening is that the conditions in many of these units were so bad that many of the kids living there were getting sick. For example, if they had asthma, that was getting exacerbated, and they were missing school. And then their educational performance suffered, and then it became this whole spiral. And so AVLF realized if we can attack it here, if we can actually improve these conditions, which were far below the housing code minimums, we can really have a lot of related benefits and kind of try to break the cycle. And they were able to put together a coalition of law firms and corporate partners. For example, Home Depot were donating dehumidifiers that some of these units really needed. And we got involved along with some other big law firms in Atlanta, and we adopted an elementary school. AVLF got a grant to get a lawyer who spends time in the school, and they identify cases for us, which are, again, affirmative housing cases, and we file those cases, challenge those conditions. If it's the other way around and the landlord is filing for eviction despite massive housing code violations, we then contest the eviction and we assert the housing code violations as a defense. And we've been now getting involved by going to events at the school, really getting to know these families, because again, that's really part of this whole concept of standing with our neighbors, which I think is such a great idea. And my colleagues in Atlanta that have gotten involved have really loved this experience. And so we're really excited to see where that could go. Secondly, our LA office has partnered with Disability Rights California and Prison Law Office to file a lawsuit in federal court challenging the conditions of confinement in the Santa Barbara County Jail. I'm really proud of their efforts. I've gotten involved in this case as well because it's an interest, again, that's, as a former public defender, conditions of confinement near and dear to my heart. And, you know, as a firm, we've really done a lot of civil rights work on behalf of prisoners. We're really proud of this work. We're really proud of standing up for the proposition that just because someone's incarcerated does not mean that they forfeit their basic human rights. And as you know, conditions of confinement is a real problem because since you don't have a right to an attorney in a civil matter, you really have no one that can bring that claim for you. You know, the prisoners in the Santa Barbara County Jail, many of whom, by the way, are awaiting trial and obviously innocent until proven guilty, they have public defenders and court-appointed lawyers in their criminal cases, but these lawyers really aren't permitted to bring a civil case to challenge the conditions. And so thankfully, Disability Rights California contacted us to get involved, and we filed a lawsuit. We're alleging inadequate medical care, inadequate mental health care, overuse of solitary confinement, and failure to accommodate inmates with disabilities. And I've personally visited the jail myself and really seen with my own eyes how bad the conditions are. I was really shocked by what I saw. Thankfully, we are in very productive settlement discussions with the attorneys for the county of Santa Barbara. And our lawsuit has already made a difference because they've instituted some interim changes. And we're really very hopeful and confident that this lawsuit will achieve some very broad and much needed reforms that are really going to operate as a sea change for the prisoners who are confined there. So I'm really proud of that work. Stay tuned on that one. And then the third thing I want to mention is I'm very proud of my colleagues in Atlanta and a few other offices for bringing an impact lawsuit on behalf of disabled veterans. My colleague, John Chandler, who's been a partner in our Atlanta office and is a veteran himself, he's recently retired, but he's still working on this case. He's a fellow with the American College of Trial Lawyers, and he's teamed up with some lawyers at Williams & Connolly, and together we have brought a lawsuit challenging the delays that disabled veterans face when appealing a denial of benefits. As you may know, the system is so backlogged and inefficient that on average, it takes 6.5 years for a veteran who loses an application for disability benefits to challenge that denial by appealing the denial and then getting a decision on remand. 6.5 years. It's just intolerably too long. And obviously our disabled veterans deserve so much better than that. So I'm really proud of their efforts. And, you know, despite our hard work, we actually initially received a negative decision. on the ground of the legal standard that the court should use when assessing the reason for the delay, which is what obviously the whole lawsuit boils down to. But thankfully, due to our sustained advocacy, earlier this summer in June, the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit reversed and held that the lower court had used the improper standard for assessing the delay. And we believe that now that the proper standard's been clarified, that we think that the proper standard is much more advantageous to the principle that we're trying to advance. So we're very hopeful of getting a good outcome in that case, and I'm really proud of my team's hard work. They put a lot of time and effort into that case. And so that's just a few of the recent matters that we've gotten involved in that I'm really excited about.
Oh, those are all great projects. It's funny that you mentioned Michael Lucas because he also was a podcast guest in the past.
Oh, that's great. I have to listen to his podcast. Michael is great.
It's a great one. Yeah, and it's definitely really important with all those housing cases because, I mean, we all talk about evicted all the time. So
right, of course.
We know that your chances of actually winning a case when you're represented is so much more because you're going against people who are represented.
Absolutely.
So we recently launched a new segment on the podcast called Tell Us About Your First Time. Could you tell us about your first or one of your early pro bono matters that you handled?
Yes. Funny title. They say you never forget your first time. And of course, that's true when it comes to pro bono. So for me, I want to talk about a DC Bar Pro Bono Center matter that I handled. Big shout out to them. They do such a great job serving indigent citizens, residents of DC. We've worked with the Advocacy and Justice Clinic for almost 10 years. They do landlord-tenant eviction defense, as well as family law, as well as disability. And one of my very first matters was a disability matter on behalf of a woman who suffered from major depression as well as PTSD stemming from being sexually abused as a child. Really awful situation. And this was not long after I joined King and Spalding. Still, compared to now, very much of a junior lawyer, still kind of feeling my way along. And this was one of my very first DC Bar matters. It was my first disability matter. And it was really challenging because the Social Security system is so Byzantine. It does so much. It's very technical, and there's some bureaucracy that you have to be able to navigate. And thankfully, the DC Bar cases come with excellent mentors. And I had a mentor that was experienced, and he was really helpful. But I still had to kind of figure it out myself to a large extent. And I had to gather voluminous medical records, analyze them, painstakingly go through massive Social Security regulations, figure out if my client's condition fit the listings as they're referred to for major depression and PTSD. And of course, I had to prepare my client to testify, which was difficult because she had had some bad experiences prior in her life and was very hesitant, had a lot of difficulty, understandably, opening up about the things that she was dealing with. And of course, in a Social Security disability hearing, you have to be very vulnerable and you have to tell the administrative law judge about your symptoms and limitations. I was able to gain her trust over time. As with the veterans matters, I have to say, these disability matters, it takes way too long to get a hearing. I think we waited for almost 18 months to get a hearing, and some people wait for even longer. And there was a story in the New York Times, I think about 6 months ago, talking about how many people who unfortunately just pass away while waiting for a hearing. There are delays throughout the system because there just need to be more administrative law judges. They're just overloaded. But the good news, the silver lining, it's not good news, the silver lining of having to wait so long is that we had a lot of time to prepare. And so that was really helpful. And I'll just never forget this client because she brought her prayer book with her to every single meeting with me and to the hearing itself, as well as her prayer beads. And they were really her source of comfort. And that really touched me. I could see, as lawyers, sometimes, we're trained and we go to law school, we go through various training programs, and we love going to court. Especially litigators, we love advocating, and it's easy to forget how difficult this process can be for clients who, like I said, have had some really negative interactions with the legal system before. And it was very difficult for this client, not only just to come to an office in Northwest DC, but the hearing itself was really challenging for her, just to get there and to open up and to answer the judge's questions, because so much was on the line. I mean, she really couldn't work, and this was her only real chance at getting some type of regular income. And it was also a little bit challenging for me, because this was my first ALJ hearing, and King and Spalding had never done this before. This was right after we got involved with the DC Bar, and so there was no one I could ask at the firm, like, how does this work? And so I was kind of learning as I went along, and thankfully my client did a really great job testifying, and based on her testimony and the medical records, which backed up her statements, we were able to get SSI benefits for her, which she's still getting. And in fact, I was reminded of this case. She called me the other day to check in, which was really nice. And she's doing really well, and it's a case I'll never forget.
That's great. Yeah, you don't really think about what it's like for people going through it, and how when you've been kind of going through something so traumatic, to be optimistic and putting yourself through this is just hard, because you have to also relive things as going through it.
Yeah, it was emotional, and that's, I think you could tell when she was testifying how credible her statements were, because it was obviously a very emotional experience for her, and I'm sure that those judges, see a lot of tears, but I think my client was extremely credible, and that no doubt helped a lot.
It's great to hear that she's doing well, though.
Yeah, it's great to keep in touch with her. I'm so happy that she's doing well.
So what's on the horizon for the firm's pro bono program? Could you tell us about a couple new things in the works?
Yeah, absolutely. We've recently expanded our efforts in the area of immigration and asylum. We're really excited about that. We've done immigration and asylum work for a long time. It's really been one of our signature areas. We find immigration and asylum matters to be so rewarding, and I've worked on these matters myself, but my colleagues, we really work on these across all of our offices, and my colleagues who work on these matters just find them to be so interesting and such a great way of giving back. And we added to that a couple of years ago, probably about 5 years ago, we started working with KIND, Kids in Need of a Defense. I'm sure you know very well, a great organization. And so we added to our repertoire by taking on the cases of unaccompanied minors who come to this country seeking a better life. And those cases have been really incredibly rewarding for us as well. I've personally worked with some of those clients, and they have such amazing stories to tell. And they're really here, again, seeking a better life. They're fleeing trauma, neglect, poverty, violence, abuse, and they have such compelling stories. And so more recently, we've decided to expand even more, because the need is so great right now. We've started working with recipients of DACA, Dreamers, and we're very proud of that work. We have a lot of King and Spalding lawyers who have mobilized to assist DACA recipients with the renewal applications. The program is being challenged, as I'm sure you know. It's a subject of lawsuits right now. So it's really important for the people who have DACA to try to renew, so that they can get those renewal applications in and hopefully get DACA status for another 2 years, which will hopefully protect them until, with any luck, there can be further legislative change, further legislative solution to extend the program. And we were able to mobilize over 60 King and Spalding lawyers to help DACA recipients, and we've helped over 100 now in approximately the last month. So I'm really proud of that work, as well as equally proud of our efforts to help detained immigrants. As you know, issues of family separation have been all over the news recently, and we see, of course, helping these immigrants who are stopped at the border as a natural extension, of course, of the asylum work that we've already been doing. And we were able to partner with Texas Civil Rights Project, which is a great organization. And we sent a team down to Texas a couple of weeks ago. We sent a team of lawyers to the Port Isabel Detention Center, where we interviewed some detained clients who had been separated from their children, and we're going to be representing them in their asylum cases and other immigration relief, as well as trying to help them reunify with their families. So we're really proud. It was really important to me as a leader of King and Spalding's program to get involved and to extend our work in these couple of ways, the immigration work that we're already doing. So really proud of my colleagues for doing that.
Great, especially because immigration in Atlanta is also kind of a different situation too, so that's since King and Spalding is in Atlanta and
Absolutely.
such a big presence.
Yes, and that's
great.
A really important part of our program. We've done a lot of asylum work with GAIN, Georgia Asylum and Immigration Network, which is a great organization.
Great. Well, thank you for talking to me today, and it's so great to hear about all the good work you're doing.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be here.
New and archived episodes of the podcast can be found on Apple Podcasts and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Please take a moment to leave an Apple Podcast review. It is quick and easy to do. We appreciate the feedback and would help us make it easier for other listeners to find the show and expand the conversation about pro bono and access to justice. We'd love to hear from you. Send your comments, feedback, and questions to probono@probonoinst.org. Looking forward to the PBI annual dinner? The dinner will be held at Gotham Hall in New York City on Thursday night, October 4th. More information can be found on our website, probonoinst.org, or call Danny Reed at 202-729-6691.